When I saw the text message pop up on my locked screen, I felt my throat tighten. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was the kind of tension you feel when you know something you've buried is about to surface, no matter how deep you tried to hide it. I picked up my phone with trembling fingers and stared at the name. My boss. My new boss. My husband sat across the room, flipping through TV channels like nothing had changed. Like I hadn't changed. I turned the screen face down on the table and walked to the kitchen, my knees barely holding me up. The air felt thick, and the silence roared louder than anything else. I thought I had time. Time to make sense of it all. Time to control the narrative. But that message, simple, short, made everything real. Thanks for today. You saved me. He had no idea what I was saving myself from. Or what I was slipping into. The worst part? I didn't know either. Because 3 months ago, I crossed a line. And now, everything in my life, everything I spent decades building, is teetering on the edge of collapse. But let me tell you what really happened, before the silence becomes permanent. Before the truth catches up with me in ways I never expected. Leave a comment below. What's the one secret you hoped would never be discovered? I never thought my life would become something I'd want to escape from. Not because it was tragic or dramatic. On the surface, it was far from that. It was structured, comfortable, ordinary. A decent home in a quiet neighborhood. A husband who always paid the bills on time and watered the plants every Sunday. But comfort can be suffocating when it's all you're allowed to feel. I had been a secretary at the same company for over 15 years. I knew the layout of the office better than my own home. I knew how many steps it took to get from my desk to the copy machine. I knew which colleagues would bring donuts and who would pretend they forgot their birthdays. Routine was my specialty. Predictability had become my second skin. At home, my husband and I existed like parallel lines, never intersecting, never touching. We shared meals, shared chores, shared a bed. But that was it. The intimacy had dissolved years ago, quietly, like a candle burning itself out. No big fight. No betrayal. Just silence. Comfortable, predictable silence. He still kissed me on the forehead before leaving for work. Still asked how my day was, though he never waited for the answer. I told myself it was enough. That after decades together, this is what marriage looked like. And maybe for some people, that was true. But something inside me had started to shift. I began noticing how often I looked at the clock, counting down the minutes not until I went home, but until I could come back to work the next day. Because work, however monotonous, gave me a sense of value. People asked for my help. They thanked me. I mattered there, even if only a little. And then, one Monday morning, everything changed. He walked in. Tall, clean-cut, about 10 years younger than me, maybe more. Sharp suit, confident eyes. He introduced himself as the new head of department. He shook my hand, firm and warm, and held my gaze for a second longer than expected. It wasn't flirtation. It was awareness. He saw me. And something inside me blinked back to life. Over the next few days, I watched how effortlessly he settled in. He made the team laugh without trying too hard. He asked for input, even mine. I wasn't used to that. Most managers had walked past my desk like I was furniture. But he stopped. He asked how I managed the calendar so precisely. He complimented my note-taking during meetings. One evening, I stayed late to help him finish a budget report. The office was quiet. The lights above buzzed faintly, and the air smelled like stale coffee and toner. He leaned over my shoulder, reviewing a spreadsheet. Our arms brushed. He didn't pull away, and neither did I. He laughed at something I said, really laughed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like a woman, not a role. When I got home that night, my husband was in his usual spot on the couch, watching something loud and unfunny. I told him I stayed late. He nodded. Didn't even look up. I showered, changed into my pajamas, and stood in front of the mirror. The lines on my face felt sharper. But there was a glow in my eyes I hadn't seen in years. I started dressing differently. Nothing dramatic, just little changes. A touch of lipstick. Heels instead of flats. A blouse that fit just right. He noticed. Not my husband, the new boss. His eyes always found me during meetings. He made jokes only I seemed to catch. Once, in the break room, he passed me a coffee and said, "I like how you always stay calm. It's rare." I smiled, but inside, I was buzzing. And then came the morning I found a post-it on my desk. His handwriting, "Need your help on the Q3 file. Can you stay after 5?" My heart raced like I was back in high school. I told myself it was just work. Nothing more. I was a professional. But I wore my best perfume that day. We stayed late. Again. Worked side by side, shoulders almost touching. He talked about his last job, how corporate life could be lonely. I listened. I told him about my son, now grown and living across the country. He nodded, genuinely interested. That night, he walked me to my car. We didn't touch. Didn't speak much. But when I drove away, I couldn't stop smiling. I told myself it was harmless. I was married. He was respectful. We hadn't crossed any lines. But something inside me knew that lines were already bending. Days turned into weeks. Our interactions became more fluid, more natural. We joked more. Shared glances in crowded rooms. And yet, nothing had happened. Nothing I could be judged for. One night, I came home late again. My husband asked if everything was okay. I said yes. He didn't question it. He never did. I watched him from the hallway, his gray hair thinning, his shoulders slightly hunched, the remote balanced on his stomach. He was a good man. Solid. Predictable. And I had become a shadow of myself. Until recently. Now, that shadow was moving. Stretching. Reaching for something warm. I started waking up before my alarm. I added songs to an old playlist. I caught myself humming in the car. At work, he left small notes, "Nice work today" or "Thanks for the catch." My colleagues noticed. One of them, a woman from HR, gave me a look I couldn't read. Maybe she saw it before I even realized it. The change wasn't loud. But it was undeniable. Something was blooming. And even though I knew it was dangerous, I didn't want to stop it. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just existing. I was becoming. The day started like any other, with the faint click of my alarm before sunrise and the same hollow quiet of the house. I moved through the kitchen on autopilot, making coffee I didn't really want, buttering toast I wouldn't eat. The sky outside was still a deep gray, the kind that made you forget the sun even existed. I stood at the window for a while, watching the emptiness. Work had become the only space where I felt alive. Not vibrant, not fulfilled, just alive. And even that was something. My thoughts kept circling around him. The way he looked at me during meetings, how his voice dipped slightly when we were alone, how he seemed to listen not out of politeness, but because he genuinely wanted to understand. I tried convincing myself it was professional admiration, maybe a mutual respect built over weeks of collaboration. But my body betrayed me. The quickened breath, the restless hands, the way I caught myself reapplying lipstick after lunch. That morning, I walked into the office and saw him already there, sleeves rolled up, reading through a stack of reports. He looked up and smiled, not the polite kind, but the kind that makes you forget how old you are or how invisible you've felt. I nodded, pretending it was routine. Pretending a lot of things. We had another late deadline looming, some internal financial review the upper levels were pushing. It was clear I would be staying late. He came by my desk around 4, leaned casually on the edge, and asked if I had time to help finalize the numbers. I said yes. I always said yes now. The hours slipped by unnoticed. The office emptied, the light outside faded, and the artificial glow of our desk lamps filled the room. We sat side by side, comparing columns, correcting formatting, and somewhere between margin adjustments and printer jams, the air began to shift. Our elbows bumped more than once. Once, he reached past me for a file, and our arms pressed together. He didn't pull away immediately. Neither did I. At one point, I made a joke, something dry, sarcastic, reflexive, and he laughed, really laughed. Not just at the joke, but in a way that felt like he was relieved. As if the weight of the entire department had temporarily lifted, and I was the reason. We paused. It was silent for a moment, except for the faint humming of the air vents. I looked at him, and he looked back. And we kissed. We didn't plan it. There was no lean-in, no cinematic music. Just a kiss. Brief. Controlled. But impossible to forget. I pulled away first. I stood up too quickly, almost knocking over my chair, muttered something about needing to check the copier, and walked out of the room. My hands were shaking. My legs, too. In the break room, I splashed cold water on my face. My reflection in the mirror was both familiar and foreign. Same lines around my eyes, same tired mouth, but something behind the eyes had shifted. I wasn't the same anymore. I waited a few minutes, long enough to slow my breathing, and returned to the office. He didn't mention the kiss. Neither did I. We finished the report in complete silence, every keystroke louder than it should have been. He walked me to my car like always. No words. Just presence. The weight of what had happened hung between us, but he didn't apologize, and neither did I. We both knew it wasn't an accident. Driving home, the roads were unusually empty. My fingers tightened around the wheel, knuckles white. I turned off the radio. I didn't want noise. I needed stillness, some small corner of my mind that wasn't spinning. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same, dim porch light, closed blinds, my husband's car already parked. The familiarity made the anxiety worse. I stood by the front door for a moment, keys in hand, wondering how to walk back into the life I had just stepped out of. Inside, he was in the living room, watching something on television. I said I was late because of deadlines. He nodded, eyes still on the screen, and asked if I'd eaten. I said I wasn't hungry. He didn't look at me. I didn't look at him. Upstairs, I changed into my nightgown, brushed my teeth, and stood by the mirror again. This time, I didn't smile. I didn't cry either. I just stared. Trying to understand who I was becoming. Lying in bed that night, the sheets felt unfamiliar. I kept my back to him. He didn't reach for me, didn't speak. Just the sound of his breathing, steady and distant. The next morning, I left earlier than usual. I needed to be anywhere but there. At work, he was already in his office, door half closed. I avoided him. Took the long way to the copier. Ate lunch at my desk. Answered emails with robotic efficiency. Every minute was survival. By noon, I received a message on my computer screen. Can we talk? Simple. Direct. I didn't answer. That evening, as I packed my bag to leave, he appeared at my desk. No smile this time. Just eyes full of quiet resolve. I'm not sorry, he said. But I won't make this harder for you. I nodded but didn't speak. I couldn't. That night, I cried for the first time in years. Not out of guilt, not even regret. It was grief for the version of me that had vanished, and the one that was slowly, frighteningly taking her place. Because once you cross a line, even a small one, everything on the other side becomes visible. And you can never unsee it. The days that followed blurred into a strange mix of routine and restraint. I arrived at the office on time, completed my tasks with practiced precision, and avoided any unnecessary interaction. I wasn't hiding, not exactly, I was managing. Managing the storm I had willingly stepped into, managing the version of myself that had awakened and now refused to go back to sleep. He didn't press. He was there, as usual, a professional, composed, but not distant. He greeted me in meetings, acknowledged my work, never overstepped. It would have been easy to believe nothing had happened between us if it weren't for the weight that hung in the air every time we found ourselves alone, even briefly. A glance that lasted too long. A pause when we passed each other in the hallway. The silence had changed. What unsettled me most wasn't guilt. It was something quieter, more stubborn. A curiosity about what came next. Because despite every intention to bury that moment, some part of me had begun to feel alive. Then came the team meeting. Everyone was gathered in the large conference room, buzzing with small talk and coffee. I arrived a few minutes late, slid into my seat, and opened my notepad. Across the table, he looked up, just briefly, and offered a soft, neutral smile. I returned it, restrained and unreadable. But someone else noticed. She sat 2 chairs to my left, a colleague from the HR department, sharp, observant, the kind who rarely spoke unless she had something calculated to say. When the meeting ended and people began to leave, she turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Always good to see teamwork in action, she said casually, then added, especially when it's so seamless. I offered a tight nod and walked away without responding. But my heartbeat had already changed rhythm. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. Too light, too pointed. At my desk, I stared blankly at the screen, reading the same sentence 3 times. Paranoia crept in like a draft from a cracked window. Did she see something? Was it obvious? Had I let down my guard without realizing? At lunch, I kept my distance. I avoided the communal table, chose instead a small side room near the record storage. I sat in silence, barely touching my food. I didn't know what I feared more, being exposed, or being seen clearly for the first time. Later that day, he stopped by my desk to ask about a client file. His voice was neutral, as always. But there was a pause, a split second too long. I glanced up and found his eyes locked on mine. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, the lie forming too quickly. "Just tired." He didn't press. He never did. But the next morning, there was a coffee waiting on my desk. No note. Just the cup, warm, familiar. I looked around. No one was watching, yet I felt eyes everywhere. I left the cup untouched. That afternoon, an email arrived from the same HR colleague. It was routine, confirmation for a compliance session the next week. But the wording felt deliberate, too formal, too polished. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment before closing the window. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was inventing shadows in a room already dimly lit. The tension followed me home. That evening, as I walked through the front door, the weight of everything hit harder than usual. My husband was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables. He looked up, briefly, and asked how my day was. I gave him the same answer I always did, fine. He didn't question it. But something in his expression lingered, a flicker of awareness, maybe. Or maybe I was projecting. Either way, I retreated upstairs before he could ask anything more. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. For years, I had moved through life with such predictability. Every decision calculated, every emotion managed. And now, it felt like I was one whisper away from unraveling. And yet, I didn't feel regret. I felt unease, yes. Guilt, in pieces. But mostly, I felt suspended between two lives, unsure which one belonged to me anymore. At work the next day, he caught me in the hallway, alone, away from the others. His tone was careful, quiet. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I just hope you know that." I looked at him, unable to answer. Not because I didn't understand, but because I understood too well. His restraint was more dangerous than any persuasion. It left the choice entirely in my hands. And I was no longer sure of my own. By the end of the week, I noticed small shifts. My colleagues seemed less talkative around me. One woman from accounting suddenly paused her conversation when I entered the break room. Another offered a tight smile before quickly walking away. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe the silence around me was changing shape, becoming denser. The HR colleague caught me by the elevator. "Everything all right?" she asked, with that same unreadable smile. "You've been quiet lately." "I'm fine," I replied, trying to sound bored. Detached. She nodded, but her eyes didn't move from mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan, the distant creak of pipes, the shallow rhythm of my husband's breathing. I wondered if he could feel the distance between us now. If he sensed that something essential had shifted. I thought of the kiss. Not the act itself, but the moment after, when everything had stilled and I realized I couldn't go back. That even if nothing else happened, something had already broken. Or awakened. Or both. In the dark, I whispered to myself the question I had been avoiding. "What do you want?" And for the first time in years, I didn't have an answer. Only silence. But it wasn't the same silence I had lived with for so long. This one had edges. This one asked to be heard. There was a moment, sometime around mid-morning, when I caught my reflection in the office window and barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, my hair was the same, makeup subtle, clothes familiar, but because something inside me had rearranged itself. I stood straighter. My eyes searched deeper. I didn't know when it happened, but the shift was undeniable. I had become someone who held a secret, and secrets, I was learning, had weight. The day had started like most others. I answered emails, organized schedules, and dealt with a minor software glitch that left half the department confused. I went about it all with the same efficiency as always. No one said anything, but I sensed it, the way conversations softened when I entered the room, the way people looked at me a little too long, or not at all. Whether it was imagined or real, I couldn't tell anymore. The line had blurred. By noon, I had received a calendar invitation from him. Nothing unusual, just a meeting request for a joint presentation we were preparing. Still, my heart jumped when I saw his name. The subject line was neutral, prep session, Q3 forecast review. But my pulse read it as something else entirely. I clicked accept and stared at the screen for several minutes, unsure what I was waiting for. The meeting was set for late afternoon in one of the smaller conference rooms, private, tucked into the far end of the building. I told myself we had done this before. That it wasn't about him, or me, or what had happened. It was work. Just work. But the voice in my head was no longer buying that line. When I walked in, he was already there, setting up a projection on the screen. He looked up, nodded once, and turned back to the laptop. No words. Just that thick, humming silence again. I took the seat beside him, and we worked. Line by line, slide by slide. He didn't touch me. Didn't look at me for too long. But everything about him, the curve of his shoulder, the quiet strength in how he moved, was familiar now. Too familiar. At one point, I dropped a folder, and as we both reached for it, our hands touched. Just for a second. It was enough to make my breath hitch. I pulled back quickly, muttered something about needing more coffee, and excused myself. In the hallway, I paused. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the paper cup. I couldn't explain what I was doing anymore. Not to myself. Not to anyone. I wasn't looking for an affair. I wasn't unhappy in the way people usually described it. I had a home. A husband who was decent. A routine that, while dull, kept life from unraveling. And yet, every time I saw him, something in me stirred, something I thought had died quietly in the background of a long marriage. When I returned to the room, he didn't comment. We continued as before, the silence between us now louder than the click of keys and shuffle of pages. As we wrapped up, he turned toward me, careful and deliberate. I've booked a site visit next week, he said. Out of town. Small client meeting. I'd like you to come. His voice was calm, businesslike, but something flickered beneath the surface. I nodded, my voice catching slightly. All right. And that was it. No invitation to cross a line. No acknowledgement of anything shared. Just two people speaking in code only they understood. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and tried to bury myself in logistics, confirming hotel bookings, organizing files, arranging travel. But my hands moved slower, distracted. The trip was only 2 days away, and already, I felt like something irreversible had begun. That evening, at home, I found my husband in the backyard tending to the grill. The smell of charcoal hung in the air, sharp and grounding. I watched him for a few seconds through the kitchen window before joining him outside. Smells good, I said. He nodded, flipping the chicken with practiced ease. Figured we could eat outside. We didn't talk much over dinner. Just the usual, weather, bills, and neighbor's new roof. He asked if I'd be home late that week. I hesitated, then told him about the site visit. He nodded again, said it was good I was being recognized for my work. His voice held no suspicion. Just support. Or maybe resignation. I wasn't sure anymore. Later, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling. His breathing was steady, calm. Mine wasn't. I closed my eyes and pictured the road ahead, the hotel room, the quiet dinners, the long hours of subtle glances and unspoken questions. I wasn't naive. I knew what this looked like. What it could become. But I didn't know how to stop it. Or if I even wanted to. The next day, the office seemed different. Colder. Or maybe it was just me. I passed the HR woman in the hallway. She didn't smile this time. She didn't even look my way. By lunch, a colleague in finance made a passing comment, something about traveling for work with a raised eyebrow that didn't need an explanation. I laughed it off, but inside, I was unraveling. I avoided him the rest of the day. Took my break early. Left the office without saying goodbye. I needed space. Time. Clarity. But even in the car, driving home through traffic and fading daylight, my mind refused to rest. At home, my husband was on the phone with our son. I overheard pieces of their conversation, something about a new apartment, a job interview. I waited quietly, letting them finish, then joined him in the kitchen. "He's doing well," my husband said. "That's good," I replied, reaching for a glass. We stood there in silence for a moment, side by side, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between us. Then he turned to me and asked, "Are you happy?" The question landed with unexpected weight. I looked at him, startled. His face was calm, open, but I couldn't find the words. "I mean," he continued, "you've been quiet lately." "Just wondering." "I don't know," I said finally. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't the whole truth either. He nodded, didn't press. Just walked past me and turned off the kitchen light. Later that night, I packed for the trip. Folded my clothes carefully. Chose practical shoes. Simple blouses. But when I opened my jewelry box, my fingers hovered over a silver bracelet I hadn't worn in years. I slipped it on without thinking. I stood in front of the mirror one last time before bed. Studied the woman staring back. She looked tired. But she also looked awake in a way she hadn't in years. And deep down, beneath the guilt, the confusion, the fear, there was something else. Expectation. The morning of the trip, I woke up before the alarm. The sky outside was still dark, the edges of the window barely touched by early light. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, letting the silence settle around me like a second skin. My husband stirred beside me but didn't wake. I watched his back rise and fall under the blanket, steady and distant. I thought about touching his shoulder, saying something, anything. But the words wouldn't come. I stood up instead, walked quietly to the bathroom, and closed the door behind me. As I dressed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My hair was neat, my makeup understated. I chose a soft blouse and a jacket that gave me shape without drawing attention. I didn't want to be noticed. And yet, I did. That contradiction pulsed under my skin like an echo I couldn't quiet. Downstairs, I moved quickly, coffee in a travel mug, my bag by the door, my phone already buzzing with updates. I left a note on the kitchen counter, meeting out of town. Back late. Nothing more. I wasn't sure why I wrote it. He already knew. But I left it anyway, as if it gave me permission to leave in other ways too. The car ride to the client site was quiet. He drove, focused, one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on the gear. We spoke briefly about logistics, the meeting schedule, a document we needed to review. It was polite, efficient, normal. But the silence between those exchanges spoke louder. There was tension, not the kind that screams, but the kind that hums just below the surface. We arrived in a small town outside the city, tucked behind a string of low hills and empty parking lots. The building we were visiting was modest, clean, efficient. The meeting itself was uneventful, technical, numbers-focused, a blur of spreadsheets and strategic forecasts. I took notes. I nodded when appropriate. I performed, as always. When it was over, he suggested we grab something to eat before heading back. It wasn't late yet, but the day had already felt long. I hesitated for a second and then agreed. We drove to a quiet restaurant on the edge of town, nothing fancy, just warm lighting and polished wooden tables. A place that felt suspended in time. We sat near the window. Outside, the sky was softening into evening, the clouds brushed with pink and gray. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and rosemary. We ordered something small, their soups, I think, and shared a loaf of warm bread. For a while, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. There was a strange comfort in the silence now, as if we both knew we were balancing on the edge of something but weren't ready to move forward or back. At some point, he leaned slightly across the table. "I'm glad you came," he said, voice low but steady. I looked up from my bowl. His eyes held mine, not searching, not demanding, just present. And we kissed. It was simple. Brief. Just one moment stretched long enough to make the world narrow down to a single point. There was no build-up, no rush. Just quiet understanding. And when it ended, we sat back, and neither of us said a word. The drive back was quieter than before. We both stared straight ahead, the road unfolding in smooth lines beneath the tires. Streetlights passed like flickers of thought, brief, disappearing. My hands rested in my lap, fingers interlaced, still intense. At one point, he reached for the radio, turned it on, then immediately turned it off. The silence was better. Truer. He dropped me off near the station, said he needed to stop at the office before heading home. I nodded. He didn't ask if I was okay. I didn't ask if he regretted it. There were no good answers. As I stepped out of the car, I felt the air shift. Cooler now, almost sharp. I pulled my coat tighter around me, clutching my bag as if it could hold the pieces I wasn't ready to examine. The train ride home was long and uneventful. People came and went. A child cried briefly in the next car. Somewhere along the ride, I realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours. I pulled it from my bag and saw a message from my husband. "Hope the meeting went well. Let me know when you're on your way." I didn't reply right away. When I finally walked into the house, it was quiet. A single lamp glowed in the living room. He was seated on the couch, remote in hand, watching something without sound. He looked up when I entered, gave me a small smile, then returned his gaze to the screen. "Everything go all right?" he asked. "Yes," I said, hanging my coat. "It was fine." "Long day?" "Yeah." He nodded, then reached for his glass. I walked past him to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The house felt smaller, somehow. Or maybe I was just more aware of its stillness. Of what had changed. Later that night, we lay in bed, backs turned. The space between us was the same as it had always been. But now, I felt it differently. Not as comfort, but as distance. Not as routine, but as absence. I closed my eyes and replayed the day in fragments, the drive, the meeting, the restaurant, the kiss. Not in sequence, but in sensations. His hand brushing mine over the table. The way the air changed just before he leaned in. The strange calm afterward. I didn't feel guilt in the way people describe it. I felt unsettled, yes. Confused. But also awake. As if some part of me had finally been acknowledged after years of being silenced. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept circling, looping through the same questions with no answers. I wondered what he was thinking. If he regretted it. If he would act differently now. If I would. In the morning, my husband made coffee. I thanked him. He asked what I wanted for dinner. I said I didn't know. We existed side by side, as always. But something had shifted. And I didn't know how to shift back. The following days moved slowly, like air thick with humidity, even though the weather had turned cooler. I went to work, sat at my desk, typed emails, answered calls. The rhythm was the same, but I wasn't. I noticed how the light hit differently in the office, how voices carried more sharply in the hall. Everything felt both louder and quieter, like I was submerged under the surface of a still lake, watching the world move above me. He didn't avoid me. He didn't seek me out either. We exchanged polite nods in meetings, brief updates on shared projects. But the silence between those moments was dense with knowing. There was no pretense now. We had crossed a line, even if it had been subtle, restrained. It was crossed nonetheless. And we both knew it. One afternoon, as I walked into the office kitchen for coffee, I heard my name. I paused, just outside the doorway. Two voices as female, speaking in low tones, just loud enough to catch pieces. "She's been different lately," one of them said. A pause. "Then, you think it's true?" "People say things for a reason." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned around and walked back to my desk, the bitter taste already rising in my throat. I didn't need to know what it was. I already did. The idea of being reduced to rumors, speculation, whispers, after all the years I'd spent fading quietly into the background, was almost ironic. That evening, I left the office as soon as I could. The ride home was a blur, the city passing by in blinks of light and shadow. I didn't turn on the radio. I couldn't stand the idea of noise. At home, my husband greeted me from the couch. He was scrolling through his phone, legs stretched out, the television on but muted. He looked up, gave me a small nod. "How was it?" "Fine," I said, setting my bag down. He studied me for a second too long. "You've been quiet lately." "I'm tired," I replied. He didn't push. He never pushed. And somehow, that made it worse. The absence of confrontation gave too much space for my own guilt to echo. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan. I thought of the way he had looked at me across the table during that dinner. Not with desire, necessarily, but with attention. Full attention. It was the rarest thing. And the most dangerous. The next morning, he asked me if I wanted to go away for the weekend. "Just us," he said. "We haven't done that in a while." I hesitated. I could hear the weight beneath his words, the quiet plea. I nodded. "All right," I said. He smiled, relieved. "I'll look into something nearby." He was trying. I could feel it. But I also knew that sometimes trying comes too late, after something essential has already slipped away. At work that day, he approached my desk mid-morning. He asked if I had a moment. We walked together to one of the smaller meeting rooms, empty and windowless. He closed the door gently behind us. "I just wanted to say," he began, "I don't expect anything." I didn't speak. "I don't want this to affect your job. Or your comfort here." Still, I said nothing. He waited a moment longer, then added, "But I won't pretend it didn't mean something." I nodded once. It did. The room was quiet after that. We didn't say more. There was nothing more to say. That evening, my husband told me he'd booked a cabin for the weekend. "By the lake," he said. "It's quiet. You'll like it." I tried to smile. "That sounds nice." We left early Saturday morning. The drive was long, but peaceful. Trees lined the road, and the leaves had begun to change. Reds, golds, the kind of beauty that made you feel both grateful and small. The cabin was modest but comfortable. A fireplace. A small kitchen. A porch with a view of the water. He unpacked our things methodically. I watched him from the doorway, wondering how many times I had taken his steadiness for granted. Wondering how long he had been waiting for me to come back to him. That evening, we made dinner together. Simple, grilled vegetables, bread, a bottle of wine. We ate on the porch, wrapped in sweaters, listening to the wind move through the trees. "I've missed this," he said suddenly. I looked at him, startled. This, us. Being close. Laughing. Talking. I nodded. My throat felt tight. "I know we've grown apart. And I don't know exactly when it happened. But I want to fix it. I didn't know what to say. His words weren't dramatic or angry. They were quiet, vulnerable. And that made them harder to face. Later that night, we sat by the fire. He reached for my hand, and I let him. We sat in silence, fingers intertwined, the flames casting soft light across the room. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. "I just want to be seen again," he whispered. And in that moment, something inside me broke. Because he wasn't the only one. We had both been invisible. To each other. To ourselves. And now, here we were, trying to find our way back through the fog. Or pretending we could. When we returned home the next day, the city felt sharper. The noise, the movement, the tension in the air, it all returned too quickly. I unpacked our bags slowly, folding clothes I hadn't worn. My husband was downstairs, watching the game, as if nothing had happened. Or maybe because something had. Monday morning came too fast. At the office, he passed by my desk and said nothing. Just a glance. But in that glance, I saw the distance. He had felt it, too. We had shared something. And now, it hovered between us, wordless, unresolved. And I didn't know which part of my life I was supposed to return to anymore. The first thing I noticed that Monday morning was the way the office light seemed harsher, colder. It wasn't the bulbs, they hadn't changed. It was me. My body felt heavier walking in, like it had learned something it couldn't unlearn. Everything around me looked the same, desks aligned like soldiers, the smell of old carpet and weak coffee, the faint echo of phones ringing in other rooms, but it all felt foreign now. Like I no longer belonged to this place, or it to me. He was already there, in his office, the door slightly open. I caught a glimpse of him through the glass, head down, focused. No nod this time. No smile. Just that faint line of tension between his brows, the one I used to read so easily. I wondered if he felt the distance too. If he regretted what had happened. Or if he was, like me, unsure of what came next. I spent most of the day avoiding the main corridors, choosing instead to stay buried in paperwork and emails. I took lunch late, in the small break room that no one used. My body was present, but my mind was somewhere else, circling endlessly around what had happened during the weekend, and what it meant now that we were back. But it didn't take long for reality to interrupt the fog. That afternoon, as I returned from the copy room, I saw her, my colleague from HR, standing in the hallway, arms folded, speaking quietly with someone from finance. They glanced in my direction as I passed, not quickly enough to hide it. The conversation stopped. The silence behind me felt heavier than the words could have been. I told myself not to react. I kept walking, steps slow and deliberate. But my heart was already racing. I knew that look. It wasn't curiosity, it was conclusion. They thought they knew. Maybe they did. When I returned to my desk, a message from him was waiting in my inbox. Need to meet Wednesday's vendor review. 6 p.m. Conference room 2. Short. Neutral. Nothing that couldn't be printed and pinned to a bulletin board without suspicion. But my breath caught anyway. I stared at the message, debating. I could pretend I didn't see it. I could decline. But I didn't. I clicked accept. The rest of the day moved with mechanical stillness. At exactly 6, I walked toward conference room 2. My heels echoed on the empty floor, the office now mostly deserted. The hallway lights had dimmed to evening mode, soft and tinted, and I could hear the hum of the air conditioning more than usual. I paused outside the door, hand on the knob, and let myself breathe. Inside, he was seated at the table, one folder open in front of him. He didn't look up right away. When he did, his expression was calm, unreadable. "We need to finalize the logistics for the vendor pitch," he said. I sat down without speaking. He walked me through the notes, budget allocations, design mock-ups, projection estimates. His tone was steady, efficient. Mine matched it. For 10 minutes, we were nothing more than two professionals preparing for a client meeting. And then the silence crept in. He closed the folder and leaned back slightly in his chair. "Is this going to ruin your life?" he asked quietly. I looked at him, the question landing with more weight than it should have. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. "I don't know," I said. He didn't respond right away. He looked at the table, then at the window behind me, then back at me. "I didn't plan for this." "I don't even think I expected anything," he said. I nodded. "Me neither." Silence again. That thick, knowing kind. I waited, unsure of what he would say next, or what I wanted him to say. "I won't reach out again," he said finally. "Not unless you want me to." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat had closed, and I felt something swell behind my ribs, a pressure I hadn't expected. We stood at the same time. I gathered my folder slowly, carefully, every motion deliberate. As I turned to leave, I paused. We spent the night together. He didn't flinch. He just looked at me, waiting. "I'm not sure what that says about me," I continued, "but I know it means something. Even if it ends here." He nodded once. It meant something. I left the room, walked back to my desk, and shut down my computer in silence. By the time I reached the front entrance, the office was empty. The street outside was quiet, bathed in streetlight. I walked to my car, keys clenched tightly in my hand, and sat behind the wheel for several minutes before turning on the ignition. When I arrived home, the house was dark except for the small light above the stove. My husband was upstairs, the faint sound of a shower running. I moved quietly through the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the sink. He came down a few minutes later, towel draped over his shoulder. "Hey," he said softly. I turned. "Hey." He studied me for a moment, then leaned against the doorway. "I meant what I said at the cabin. I want us to find our way back." I looked at him. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't demanding. Just offering something raw. "I know it won't be easy," he added. "But I'm willing to try. If you are." I nodded, slowly. "I want to." And in that moment, I meant it. But deep inside, I also knew something else. That part of me had already wandered too far. That even if I tried, something fundamental had shifted. The thread that once tied me to this life had loosened, frayed. And I didn't know if it could be knotted back the same way. 8. It was strange how quickly life pretended to return to normal. In the following days, I woke up at the same time, drank the same weak coffee, drove the same route to work. The routine wrapped itself around me like a familiar coat, soft from wear, slightly threadbare, but dependable. Yet under the surface, everything felt off balance. Like I was walking on a floor that tilted just slightly beneath my steps, never enough to make me fall, just enough to keep me from feeling steady. At the office, things grew quieter. Not professionally, emails still arrived, meetings still happened, printers still jammed. But around me, something shifted. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Smiles turned to nods. One colleague avoided eye contact altogether. It wasn't dramatic or overt, but it was clear. The silence had a shape now. And I knew exactly what it was. Rumors don't require confirmation to spread. They survive on tone and glance, on pauses and timing. No one ever said anything directly. But they didn't need to. He and I didn't speak outside of work necessities. Our interactions had been reduced to emails, bullet points, brief acknowledgments in passing. He wasn't cold. He was careful. Maybe out of respect. Maybe out of guilt. Maybe because he didn't know what to do with what we'd become. I didn't either. One afternoon, I left the building a little later than usual. The sky was already darkening, and the air carried the distinct crispness of late fall. I stopped at a cafe on the way home, not one I usually went to. I ordered tea, sat by the window, and just watched people. It was something I hadn't done in years. Not because I didn't have the time, but because I'd forgotten what stillness felt like. Outside, a couple walked by hand in hand. They weren't young, maybe in their 60s. She said something, and he laughed. Not just politely, but deeply, the kind of laugh that shakes your whole chest. She smiled at him like it was the first time. And something in me cracked. I turned my face to the window to hide it, even though no one was watching. That night, at home, I cooked dinner. Nothing special, just roasted vegetables and rice. My husband came in, kissed my cheek, thanked me. We ate in the quiet rhythm we'd developed over the years. Conversation dotted here and there, something about a news article, a comment about work, a plan for the weekend. It was normal. Safe. Afterward, as we cleaned up, he asked if I wanted to go out on Saturday. A movie. Maybe dinner. It's been a while, he said, not looking at me. I said yes. It wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the truth either. That night, I sat on the couch alone after he went upstairs. The TV was on, volume low. I wasn't watching. I was thinking about how many versions of myself existed now. The woman he thought I was. The woman my colleagues whispered about. The woman who sat in silence with a man who once made her feel seen. And somewhere in between, the real me, quiet, tired, splintered. The next morning at work, I found a small envelope in my drawer. No name. Just my initials on the front, in handwriting I recognized immediately. Inside was a single line. Asterisk, this isn't how it ends. Unless you want it to be. Asterisk. I sat very still for a long time, the paper open in my lap. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I didn't react at all. Because I didn't know what it meant. Was it a promise? A threat? A confession? Or was it nothing more than a goodbye dressed in ambiguity? I folded the note and placed it in my purse. That evening, I walked into the house and immediately sensed something was off. It was too quiet, even for us. My husband sat at the dining table, a piece of mail open in front of him. His hands were folded. When he looked up, his face was unreadable. I saw you, he said. My breath caught. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam anything. He just sat there, steady, quiet. In the parking lot. Last week. After your meeting. I couldn't move. My hands, my feet, frozen. I didn't want to believe it, he continued. I waited days to ask. I thought maybe I imagined it. But I didn't. Still, I said nothing. I haven't been blind, he said. I just didn't want to admit it. I thought maybe you'd come back. The silence between us was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. I don't want details, he said after a moment. I don't think I could handle that. But I do want to know what happens now. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Because I didn't know what happened now. I didn't have a plan. I had choices, sure, but none that came without loss. He stood up, slowly. I'm going to my brother's tonight. Give us both some space. And just like that, he walked past me, picked up his coat, and left. The door closed behind him with a softness that felt final. I stood in the hallway for a long time, not moving. Eventually, I walked into the living room and sat down, still holding my purse. I took out the envelope. Reread the note. Asterisk, this isn't how it ends. Unless you want it to be. Asterisk. And for the first time since this all began, I understood something clearly. It had already ended. Now I had to decide what would begin. The house was quiet after he left, quieter than it had ever been. Not the comfortable kind of quiet we'd lived in for years, but something hollow and cold. Like all the furniture had been rearranged by ghosts, and nothing was in the right place anymore. I didn't turn on any lights, didn't touch the remote, didn't make tea to fill the silence. I just sat in the living room, surrounded by the echo of his words and the weight of everything I hadn't said. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the bed fully dressed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer some kind of answer. My phone buzzed twice, one message from him, simple, "I'm safe." And another, from an unknown number. No name. Just a single word. Asterisk still. Asterisk. I didn't reply to either. I placed the phone face down and let the dark wrap around me like water. The next morning, I moved mechanically. Showered, dressed, applied makeup out of habit rather than purpose. I packed a small overnight bag and left it by the front door. I didn't know if he would come home that day. I didn't know if I would still be here when he did. At work, the air felt denser than usual. Whispers seemed louder. Every glance stung a little more. I walked through the halls like someone who didn't belong anymore. Or maybe never had. I avoided his office, took a longer route to the copier, answered emails from my phone instead of my desk. But even then, I could feel him nearby, his presence like static in the room, always there, just out of reach. At noon, I found a folded note on my keyboard. Plain paper, no name. Park bench. 6 p.m. No expectations. I didn't need to ask who it was from. The rest of the day crawled by. I tried to work, but my mind kept spinning. Not in circles, more like spirals. Everything seemed to collapse inward, my marriage, my job, the version of myself I had tried so hard to protect. And now, here I was, watching it all slowly dismantle without anyone to blame but myself. By 5:30, I had made up my mind. I left the building without saying goodbye to anyone. The sun was already low, casting the city in gold and rust. I walked the few blocks to the park, my heart beating just loud enough to drown out my thoughts. He was already there. Seated on the far bench, his coat draped over one arm, a paper cup of coffee in the other. When he saw me, he didn't stand. Just offered a faint nod, as if to say, "You came, that's enough." I sat beside him. Not too close. Not far either. For a few minutes, we didn't speak. We watched the trees instead, their branches swaying against the fading sky. A dog barked in the distance. A jogger passed. Everything around us continued, oblivious to the fracture between us. Finally, he said, "I heard." I turned to him slightly. "How? Does it matter?" His voice was calm. Not unkind. I shook my head. He exhaled slowly. "I never wanted to be the reason things fell apart." "You weren't," I said. "Not really." He looked at me then, and in that glance, I saw the fatigue. The confusion. Maybe even regret. But beneath it, something steadier. Not love. Not exactly. But care. Genuine, quiet care. "I won't ask you to explain," he said. and I won't ask you to stay. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted. I'm not proud of any of it. You don't have to be proud, he replied. You just have to be honest. With yourself. That hit harder than I expected. We sat in silence again, letting his words settle. Then he added, if this is the end, I'll respect that. I nodded. I think it has to be. He didn't try to change my mind. He didn't reach for my hand. He just said, then let's end it with dignity. We both stood. He gave me a small, sincere smile. I returned it, even if it didn't fully reach my eyes. As I walked away, I didn't look back. I didn't have to. Some goodbyes don't require a dramatic finish. Sometimes the quiet ones hurt more. When I got home, the house was still empty. My overnight bag remained by the door. I sat on the couch and stared at it for a long time. I thought about leaving. About booking a hotel. About disappearing for a few days just to breathe. But instead, I went upstairs, changed into something soft, and opened the windows. The air was cool, clean. For the first time in days, it felt like I could take a full breath. Later, I found myself in the kitchen, making tea. Not out of habit, but because I wanted something warm to hold. Then I opened my laptop. Not for work. Not for distraction. I opened a blank document and wrote one sentence. This is how I disappeared without ever leaving. And then I kept writing. Because I didn't know where this story would go next. But I knew it was finally mine to tell. The following morning arrived like any other, but I felt different, unmoored. I didn't wake up to the sound of his shower or the smell of his coffee. The house was still. My bag still sat by the door, untouched. The kitchen counters were clean, no coffee cup left out, no newspaper folded in half. Everything was in its place, and yet it felt like something essential had been removed. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring out at the early light spilling across the street. There was no drama to the morning. No breaking point. Just the lingering realization that something between us had ended quietly in the middle of an ordinary week. I went through the motions, made tea, dressed in clothes that felt neutral, safe, invisible. I chose flat shoes, a cardigan, and skipped makeup entirely. I didn't want to draw attention, even though it felt like everyone already saw through me. At the office, no one said much. A few nodded when I passed, a few others looked away. I kept my head down. I answered emails, organized files, checked schedules. The day moved in small, mechanical steps. No messages from him. No folded notes. Just silence. Maybe he was gone already. Maybe he'd chosen to leave before I had the chance to. I couldn't blame him. Around lunchtime, I received a meeting invitation from HR. No subject line, just a time and room number. My stomach dropped. I clicked accept and sat still for several seconds before realizing I was gripping the mouse too tightly. The meeting room was small and windowless. A woman I barely knew waited inside, her hands folded neatly on the table. I just wanted to check in, she began. Her tone was soft but measured. There have been conversations. Some concerns raised. I'm not here to make accusations. I just want to make sure you're okay. I nodded. I'm fine. She paused, perhaps expecting more. When none came, she said, sometimes situations can become difficult. Especially when personal and professional lines blur. There it was. I understand, I said. No decisions are being made right now, she added. But I'd advise discretion. People notice more than they admit. I thanked her, stood, and left the room before she could say anything else. My hands trembled slightly as I walked back to my desk. No one stopped me. No one spoke. But everything had changed. That night, I didn't go home right away. I drove to the outskirts of the city, past the familiar buildings, until the roads grew quieter. I parked near the river, rolled down the window, and let the cold air wash over me. I sat like that for almost an hour, watching the dark water move beneath the bridge. There was nothing profound in the view. No answers in the current. But at least it didn't ask anything of me. When I finally returned home, the lights were still off. I stepped into the silence, removed my shoes, and placed my keys on the hallway table. The house smelled faintly of lavender, left over from the candle I had burned 2 nights ago. I wandered into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, unsure of what to do next. Then I picked up the overnight bag I had packed days ago. I carried it upstairs, unzipped it, and began putting everything away. Slowly. One piece at a time. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something simpler, closure. Later, I sat down at the small writing desk near the bedroom window. The same one I had ignored for years. The page from the night before still sat open on the screen. I reread the line I'd written, asterisk, this is how I disappeared without ever leaving. Asterisk. I deleted it. And began again. Asterisk, I wanted something to change. I didn't know it would be everything. Asterisk. The words flowed slower this time, but they came. I wasn't writing for anyone else. Not for clarity or confession. Just to understand. Just to feel the weight of my own voice. 2 days passed before my husband returned. He walked through the door without ceremony, carrying an overnight bag and wearing the same jacket he'd left in. We stood in the hallway, facing each other. I waited for words, but none came right away. Finally, he said, I'm not here for an apology. I wouldn't give you one, I replied, not harshly. Just honestly. I'm not angry, he added. I'm tired. I know, I said. We stood there, the space between us vast but calm. Do we try again, he asked. I don't know. Do you still love me? I didn't answer right away. I don't think love is the question. He nodded once. Then maybe time is. He didn't unpack his things. He placed the bag by the stairs and went to make tea. I returned to my desk, opened my document, and kept writing. That night, we slept on opposite sides of the bed. Not out of anger. Just habit. The room was filled with silence, but it no longer felt cruel. It felt necessary. Like 2 people pausing to breathe before deciding whether to rebuild or walk away. Weeks passed. The office shifted. He announced he was leaving, taking a new position in another city. No one asked questions. I didn't either. His last day, he left a single envelope on my desk. I waited until I got home to open it. Inside was a note. Thank you for seeing me. I hope you keep seeing yourself. There was no signature. None was needed. That weekend, I took a walk through the park alone. The air had warmed. Flowers were beginning to push through the soil. Everything was quiet. Soft. Honest. I didn't know what the future held. I wasn't sure if my marriage would survive, or if I even wanted it to. I didn't know where I would be a year from now. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. Because I had stopped waiting to be rescued. And started learning how to stand still.
Bye.